Good afternoon, and welcome to a brand new year of programming at the American Antiquarian Society. This is the first program of the year called Perspectives from the Collections, and the topic is the Basin book. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active and vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs. I'm going to keep my remarks very short because we have a lot to share with you today, but we do have a large audience, and I want to just say a few things about the American Antiquarian Society because some of you may not be familiar with AAS. So we are a national research library of printed and manuscript materials that date to before 1900. And we welcome researchers from around the world and from right here in Worcester to use our collections, both physical and digital. We also host programs like this one that feature aspects of our collections. And we hope that you will visit our website to learn much more about our programs. My colleague, Lauren Havilis, Programs Coordinator, will be putting links and relevant information into the chat throughout the program, so you want to take a look at that. She also will be operating the document camera here in our classroom space. I also want to give a shout out to Nate Fisk, our photographer and media producer, who will be helping behind the scenes up in our conservation lab, and you'll be seeing that later on in the program. We will have time for your questions later on in the program, so please know that you can use the Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen to put your questions in, and you can do that at any time during the program, and we'll get to those after our presenters. And do know that this program is being recorded, and you can watch it later on YouTube. That will go up very shortly after the program. I am going to introduce each of our speakers in order of appearance in the interest of time. But know that you can read longer versions of their bios on our website with the program description. I do want to note at the outset that one of our scheduled speakers, Michael Zinman, had to cancel unexpectedly yesterday, no fault of his own, but we were able to get the ideal person in JP Ascher to serve in his stead, and you will hear about him very soon. So without further ado, I'm going to begin by introducing our speakers. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Elizabeth Watts-Pope, who happens to be here on my right. Elizabeth is curator of books and digitized collections at the American Antiquarian Society. Elizabeth has been with the Society since 2004. It's 20 years, Elizabeth. Nice.
It is.
She has also served here as a head of reader services and in acquisitions. She works closely with our digitization partners to make AAS collections materials as widely available as possible. Next up will be JP Ascher, who is research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Broadly, he studies bibliographical methods along with early modern to digital knowledge dissemination by examining paperwork history, the history of books in society, and the technology of printing and digital transmission. Among many other projects, he is currently putting together a bibliographic census of known copies of pre-1800 copies of the 1640 Basin book. And we are so delighted that he stepped in at the 11th hour to share his expertise with us. Our next speaker following JP will be Nancy Fresella-Lee, who is conservation assistant at AAS. She completed graduate studies in art history at the University of Cambridge. Her affiliation with the Society began while she was a student at the North Bennett Street School in Boston, when she undertook an internship in our conservation lab with our chief conservator, Babette Gehnrich. A member of the Concord Historical Commission, Nancy is also working on a project to house the Concord Museum's book collection, following conservation practices that she learned here at AAS. Babette Gehnrich has been the Society's chief conservator since 1989. In that capacity, she is responsible for managing a comprehensive preservation program for the library's collections. She received her formal training in book and paper conservation and handbook binding in Berlin, Germany, and at the Centro del Libro Astana in Switzerland. And Babette will be joining us for the Q&A portion of this afternoon's program. And it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Elizabeth Pope to get things underway.
So I wanted to start by asking what may seem to be a simple question. What are people talking about when they talk about the Bay Psalm book? And its corollary question, why might we care? If you've heard of the Bay Psalm book, you may have heard its claim to fame is that it's the first book printed in America. But this is not true. You could correctly describe it as the first surviving full-length book known to have been printed in British North America, or alternatively in what is now the United States, completed in 1640. But there are really so many other interesting things to know about it. So here's some historical knowledge you can take away to impress your friends with, or possibly get a question right on Jeopardy! A quick answer to what we're talking about could be given by breaking down the name Bay Psalm Book. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, early English colonists translated the Psalms from Hebrew scripture into English verse in meter so they could be sung as part of worship services, and then published them in book form. Hence, we now refer to the Bay Psalm Book, although this was never the actual title of the book. When people talk about the Bay Psalm Book, they're usually talking about the 1640 first edition. But I'd like to encourage us to think and talk about Bay Psalm books, plural. There are multiple copies, even when we're talking about the all-important first edition from 1640. There are about a dozen known copies still surviving. And there were dozens of editions published throughout the later 1600s and 1700s with numerous revisions. So turning over now to the document cam, I've pulled a few examples to show you, just two. They are the earliest Bay Psalm books at AAS that we know were printed in America. One is that 1640 first edition, which AAS has had since Isaiah Thomas deposited it at the AAS library in 1820, over 200 years ago. And the other is the later 1709 edition that AAS acquired only recently in AAS terms, which was about a decade ago. This 2014 addition to the AAS collection required extensive conservation work and was rehoused. You'll be hearing more about that shortly, in order to stabilize it so that it could be safely handled by researchers, including the one you'll hear from in a moment. The actual title of the first edition, this is that trivia question if you want to have it. The actual title of the first edition is the Whole Book of Psalms, and later editions like the 1709 one have the title The Psalms, Hymns, and Spiritual Songs of the Old and New Testament. Of course, they're really much longer titles because, as we all know, in the 17th and 18th century, your title went forever. The 1640 edition is not, as I mentioned, the first printing done in America. That was actually done in Mexico City 100 years earlier. It's also not the first printing done in British North America, or what is now the US. It is the first complete book that a copy is known to have survived of. But Governor John Winthrop reported that a broadside and an almanac had been printed earlier. And I'm going to show you I'm not sure if we can actually peek in here because we're going to be very careful with the format here. But I just wanted to show you that title page. See if we can get it visible. It might be a little bit tricky. Here you can see the Whole Book of Psalms from 1640. So what appears on the title page is 1640. I don't know if we can zoom in a little bit, but all right, that's as far as we're going. Just trust me here, it says 1640. But it had been actually printed over a number of years. The first printing was done between the arrival of the press in 1638 and this work's completion in 1640. And an interesting fact about the 1640 first edition is that it was published by a woman. She owned the printing press, the type, and etc. And that's usually what we mean when we talk about a publisher. Elizabeth Glover had inherited the press. Oh, here we got some help. Thanks. Elizabeth Glover inherited the press setup when her husband died on the trip over from England. And the press work was probably done by Stephen Day, a blacksmith, or his son Matthew, who had apprenticed with a printer in England. We're going to pull that just a little. There we go. Now you can kind of get the view here. Beautiful. And just so we don't go too long here, I'll just go over a few key points. That corollary to my original question I started with was, why should we care? Or why might we care about these Bay Psalm books? And I would argue it's because of the cultural importance of their printing, their poetry, music, the provenance, and the scholarly interest that these Bay Psalm books hold. So we've talked some about the printing, but the music. So as I've said, these psalters were the psalms made into verse form so that it could be sung. So it was like metered verses. And that's what we have in here are the actual text of what would be sung. But what's so wonderful about this 1709 edition that we've more recently acquired is that it actually has at the back the actual musical notations printed. So you can get a little bit of a view there of that. And this is the earliest example in the AAS collections of printed music done in America, in what became the United States. There were earlier, the 1698 edition of the Bay Psalm book also included this, but AAS doesn't have that one, unfortunately. So that musical notation helps remind us how real people use these psalters. We can almost see it in their hands, see folks leaning over the book. In the 18th century, singing schools also became an increasingly popular choice for young people, and they often recording over singing. So I just love to think of these books and how they actually were used by people. The poetry within these, you could almost argue instead of it's music, but it's also poetry. Early American literature could be studied from the translation here. The translation was done by Puritan divines like Richard Mather and John Eliot. They were translating Hebrew into English, but it takes a certain amount of literary work to do that. And so you could think of this as early American poetry in some ways. And then also the provenance, how the materials get to AAS. The example that we have here from 1709 has family annotations that you'll be hearing more about. It was identified at a small country auction in Connecticut by dealers who alerted AAS. And this really shows how it takes a village to have material come to the society. It was acquired through a donation from the Daniels Foundation in honor of Bill Pettit, an AAS counselor. And then the conservation and housing funds for those were provided by AAS staff members and staff and members. And then there's the scholarly interest. So I hope this very much of a whirlwind overview of Bay Psalm books has helped pique your curiosity. And you can see why they're of interest to collectors, to curators like myself, to bibliographers and conservators, musicologists, literary scholars, and others. As a curator, I'm especially interested in what these books tell us about how they're made and the lives that they lived afterwards, and thus the stories we can tell about the people who use these books. And so the one thing I hope you'll take away from today from me is that these Bay Psalm books were produced and used by a variety of people, many more than may just appear on the title page, if anyone appears on the title page. Children were using them. Everyday people were writing in them. A woman might have been the publisher of them. And a blacksmith or a young printer's apprentice may have been the ones working on it. And I have one last thing that, speaking of title pages, I just wanted to show you one other psalter. So those are the psalm books that have been made for, thanks for the help. Let's scooch everything. So you mentioned this Bay Psalm book that we're talking about the conservation work on today is the one from 1709. And that same year, so this is the one we're talking about, and that same year, 1709, we have a different psalter, psalm book, that's the Massachusetts or Massachusetts psalter, depending on if you're using the Algonquin language version or the English version of the psalter. And this was published in 1709 by one of the publishers of the Bay Psalm book in what became the US in North America. So this one is published by Bartholomew Green, who along with John Allen, who's the one who is printing this one, the 1709 Bay Psalm book. Bartholomew Green, but also you see J. Printer. And J. Printer was an English version of the name of Wowis, who was a native indigenous person of Nipmuc descent here in the area who was doing the printing work on not just this psalm book, but many other books in the Algonquin language. So that's just an example of the types of things that we don't always see on the title page. In this case, he did get his name on there, but it isn't always there. And that's why expanding our interest beyond just the 1640 first edition and its symbolic status opens up whole new avenues to explore. And it reveals so many more people's hands who were making and holding these psalm books. And now to take us through some of those avenues to explore regarding bibliographic history of the Bay Psalm book editions, I'm going to turn it over to J.P. Ascher.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Stay on for a second because I want to make sure you can see my slide. How's that? Can you see the slide? You give me a thumbs up? Yes, good. Well, good. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a great honor to be here on short notice covering for Michael Zinman, without whom my project would hardly be a glimmer of an idea. I've worked with his collection, which, like the American Antiquarian Society's collection, fleshes out the understudy history of the role of the Bay Psalm book in American life. And please forgive any playfulness covering my infelicities tonight. I actually just flew back from the United States and I'm on like day 2 of not sleeping. So to me, it's both like after 9 p.m. in Edinburgh, where I am, and like 5 p.m. in Worcester. And I'm very confused, but I'm here. So, as Nan and Elizabeth mentioned, I've been completing a bibliographical census of all the functional and everyday editions of the Bay Psalm books. So there's over 60 known editions in about 300 different copies. I'm about halfway through examining the copies, so I have a good sense of the overall shape of the history. Tonight, I'd like to convince you that our abiding interest in the 1640 edition should be complemented with an even stronger interest in the later editions, and that we must understand these other important editions to understand the history of the work in American life. For example, Elizabeth's already mentioned several ways in which these books continue to be used, in which other editions appeared, and Nancy will show you another particularly interesting copy. But for me, the basic bibliographical method, which is what I'll be showing you tonight, for investigating this is simple enough. You find the evidence and you lay it out in a chronology as best you can, and you look at turning points. And that's what you have on your screen right now. I'm going to give you a rough outline. I have a lot more details than this, but we don't have all night. And I'm going to try to demonstrate some of the excitement of the basic bibliographical method. This is an active research project for me, so I'll point out some of my own uncertainties, but even with these uncertainties, the general outline will already be able to show us some interesting moments in the history of this book. The Cambridge, Massachusetts printed editions include the heavily studied 1640 edition, the 3 copies of the 1647 edition, and the 1651 printing of the revised text. There's one more edition that some sources believe exists, making it possible 4 total editions, but I don't think the 4th actually really exists. These copies are what Elizabeth outlined so well at the beginning, a sort of Puritan commodity, collaboratively written and meant to compete with the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter and replace the Ainsworth Psalter popular with the Pilgrims. But the story doesn't end there. London printers took note of the new Psalms and printed responses to them while reprinting portions of the text between 1644 and 1652. These are likely the last years that the book was read as an Atlantic book rather than an American book. Then there are a series of what I call Atlantic editions, produced roughly during the same time period, from around 1648 to 1682. Henry Dunster and Richard Lyon edited the text, added hymns, more preliminary material, and essentially created the version of the text of the Bay Psalm book that would be read, sung, and used for over a century. They may have been printed in Cambridge, England, or Amsterdam, or London, or even Oxford, and a great deal of bibliographical research has attempted to investigate this. I'm working on it too, of course. But what really matters here is not exactly where it was printed. It's that all these sites of printing are hard to tell apart because these are commodity Atlantic editions meant to attach to Atlantic editions of the Bible. After that, there are Massachusetts translations, which I don't have time to go into and are utterly fascinating. And London eventually begins producing editions to match their monopoly Bibles. You'll see this after the Massachusetts translations. You see, particular printers in London were granted monopolies on certain text, and they wanted to sell copies of their Bibles, for which they had a monopoly, to the colonists who wanted their version of the Psalms. So we have two different Bible sizes between 1671 and 1654, which match with the variety of monopoly Bibles printed that they wanted to sell in the colonies. Meanwhile, after printing the book in Cambridge, Americans printed larger copies of the Psalms in Boston for the purposes of reading. A few copies were printed in places other than Boston, but they matched the Boston reading editions in size and form, so just to make things look simple, I call them Boston editions, though they're not all from Boston. Almost never attached to Bibles, these Boston editions were likely printed because people wanted to read them. The text is legible, unlike the tiny text of the later London Monopoly editions. Following the same pattern, the printer The King in Edinburgh also had a Bible monopoly and printed a competing version of the Bible. To sell these commodity Bibles in the colonies, they needed the Psalms that those colonies wanted too, and we get some Scottish editions. Lastly, in 1758, Thomas Prince, after spending a lifetime studying and editing the base Psalm book, produced a revised version. Many copies are presentation copies from his widow because he died shortly after it was printed. It went to 2 editions, and its unpopularity, along with the Revolution, essentially extinguished the market for the base Psalm book. This is an extremely brief outline of a lot of stuff, but already points to some interesting turning points. Nancy will be showing you an important early Boston reading edition with further evidence of just how much more useful these books were designed to be. They kept adding pieces. But I'd like to draw your attention to a favorite of mine, and Michael Zinman's actually, the last Boston reading edition. Notice that Prince's edition appears in 1758 as a replacement for the earlier text. But 4 years later, after that text appears, we get one more Boston reading edition with the old version of the text in 1762. The preceding Boston edition was 1744, nearly 2 decades earlier. And earlier Boston editions were generally reprinted every 2 to 5 years, so this gap suggests something unusual was going on. Well, something unusual is going on. These are pictures of bindings on these 1762 Boston editions, and you'll notice the leather is reused. It's been soaked off other books and put on this. Also, a number of copies exist in sheets. You can see the sheets on the right, and I'm grateful to John Overholt at the Houghton and Elizabeth Pope at the AS for letting me measure these, and also Bryn Mickelson-Ziegler at the Rosenbach, who helped me think about where in the binding process would be. But there's a lot of these kind of unusual bindings on this, and so this irregular moment in the time suggests a sort of irregular situation with the warehouse or the printing. It's not totally clear, but the irregularity is quite visible. But Michael Zinman, ever the provocateur, noticed the typography. The chutzpah of putting your name prior to the beginning of the first psalm is bonkers. Absolutely bonkers. The printer puts his name, Fleet, Psalm 1, right at the head. None of them have this. And thanks to Jim Green's help, we've only found evidence of this printer doing this one other time in a catechism. And so this points to the general problem with this particular moment. So we can see it's a turning point on the chronology. We can see something really weird is going on with all the bindings, and there's something weird going on with the typography. And then we get the fun time of speculation. The printer's device at the very end is a crown on a heart. After the American Revolution, this sign was torn down because it was considered not really appropriate in the new country to have a kind of royalist symbol. So the hypothesis that I find attractive, but haven't found any evidence of yet, is that Fleet was an opportunist who saw the lack of success of Prince's edition and thought, hey, maybe I can sell an old royalist edition and create a new market for this. I don't know if that's true. I have no idea, but these exciting hypotheses are what these things point to, and this is part of what bibliographical methods do. You begin to find things that you can see which ask historical questions that you can investigate with other materials. And now I'd like to turn it over to Nancy in the Conservation Lab.
Thanks, JP. I loved seeing those reused bindings and those books and sheets. That was fun. Welcome everyone to the Conservation Lab. We're now going to take a closer look at the material features of the 1709 Psalm book, and then I'll describe some of the conservation treatments that it received. When this copy of the newly rediscovered 14th edition came into the lab. Photographs that were taken to document the condition when it arrived. The book has exhibited a considerable amount of wear and tear. Its front cover was completely detached. The slightly warped back cover was barely hanging on to the remnants of the book's spine, and pieces of the very worn leather spine itself were missing. Next slide, please. In addition, the sewing that once held the text block together was deteriorating, and the pages were quite dirty from 3 centuries of use by readers. Luckily, there weren't any major paper tears throughout the book. As you can see in the photograph on the right, the shape of the text block was out of alignment. The text block was concave rather than square. You can also see that one of the headbands was literally hanging by a thread. It was immediately apparent that the book was in fragile condition. Even examining it gingerly was precarious. Each time the book was handled, there was a real possibility of causing further damage to it. If left as it was, Babette and the library's curators knew that it would be problematic to allow scholars to handle and study it. So the conservators' goal was to restore the book so that it could be handled more safely. Before embarking on any treatments, the first responsibility of conservators is to document the object at hand by describing its physical components and making detailed notes about its condition. Most book historians and conservators love to examine all kinds of old books, even if they're in poor shape, and sometimes especially when they're in poor shape. With their innards exposed, much can be learned by examining what their material properties from an archaeological perspective. It's useful to think about what this psalm book would have looked like when it was fresh off the press and newly bound. To do that, I want to call attention to a few more of its features. First, its size tells us something about how it was printed. The book is quite small. It's about 4 3/4 inches high and 3 inches wide. The text was printed on laid rag paper that was made from some combination of cotton and flax linen rags. Now keep in mind that the first American paper mill was established in 1690 in Philadelphia, and it wasn't until 728 that book publisher Daniel Henchman ventured into the paper making business and built a paper mill in Massachusetts. So where then did John Allen, the printer identified on the title page of this psalm book, get his paper for this edition? Presumably it was imported from England, arriving by ship in Boston, where it could easily have been brought to Allen's printing shop that wasn't located far from the wharf. So far, no evidence of a watermark has been found on any of the pages of this book. Otherwise, that could help us pinpoint more exactly where the paper was made. This psalm book was printed as a duodecimo, a term that is used for a small book that results from folding each printed sheet into 12 leaves or 24 pages. After printing, the paper would have been folded and then assembled into signatures or gatherings. The signatures were sewn together on 4 raised bands, in this case twice, first in Boston in 1709, and then resewn by me here in Worcester 305 years later. The photo on the left shows the uncovered raised bands after the book was resewn in the conservation lab and before the leather binding was put back on. It's underweight, while the Japanese tissue spine lining that was applied is drying. As can be seen on the right, when the reback leather spine and covers were reattached, the raised sewing bands were covered by molding the dampened leather around them during the binding process. And in this slide too, you might just make out some tooling on the spine that you won't see anywhere else, so I want to point that out now. And next slide, please. The end sheets of this copy of the psalm book are particularly beautiful. The binder used marble paper in a pattern known as the Old Dutch pattern. It's very likely that this element of the book was also imported. That marble paper was used at all is somewhat unusual because in early American bindings, they often have plain paper end sheets. Decorated paper would have been scarce and expensive. Although this can't be seen in photographs, three edges of the text block were gilding gold. When Elizabeth was talking and showing the book, I noticed that you could make that out, but we didn't take pictures of that. I don't know if you can see it in the slide that's shown. Next slide, please. After the book was bound, both the front and back covers, as well as the spine, were decorated with gold tooling. From this copy of the Psalm book, the binder chose to decorate the covers with a well-known pattern known as the Cambridge panel, another touch of luxury. The Cambridge panel pattern originated in late 18th century England, while binders who worked in that famous British university city frequently decorated their books in this style. The Cambridge panel pattern did not necessarily originate from there. According to David Pearson, who recently published a study of binding over the centuries in Cambridge, the Cambridge panels are found in English bindings made between about 1690 and 1740. So this 1709 edition of the Psalm book falls into that bracket. So now I'm going to describe it. So as you're looking at the picture of it, first, around the outer edges, close to the edges of the book, there's a double line framing of the covers. Inside, a thinner rectangular frame is composed of a straight line, and very close next to it is a zigzag border. This tooling was done using a rolling brass tool, like the one in this photo. I'll show you the real thing in just a few minutes. And on the four corners, four florons are projecting out of the corners. On the right is another star book reserved at AAS. It's New England's Memorial by Nathaniel Morton, which was bound by John Ratcliffe in 1669. As you can see, basic Cambridge panel designs were used to decorate both books, but they were made 40 years apart. Although the brass tools that were used to do this tooling were similar, by close examination, we saw that they weren't the same, unfortunately. We'd love to find, it would be great if we could find other examples of book covers where the same tools were used. On the title page of the Psalm book, we find information this 1709 14th edition was printed in Boston. It was printed by John Allen for Eliezer Phillips under the Exchange in King Street. Allen was an immigrant from England where he had learned his trade. In 1709, he was running a printing office in Boston on Pudding Lane, adjacent to King Street, which is what we know today as State Street. Now, a little sleuthing that I did on Phillips proved really fruitful, and I was so excited to learn that he was not only a bookseller, but he was also a book binder. That was a surprise. So I suspect that it was Eliezer Phillips who actually bound this copy of the Psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and then sold it in his shop, which would have been just around the corner from Allen's workshop. This, of course, is speculation, but it's fun to think about. I want to point out one extra very special feature of this book, which I especially loved finding. You can see it in the photo on the left. It's the little pamphlet that sticks out at the back of the book. And the edges are kind of curling up. What is it? It's a booklet or a little pamphlet that was made by folding 4 pages together and sewing them. It was used to record essential genealogical information about the family of William and Olive McNutt. Though it could have been left loose or just tucked between the pages, someone took the trouble to actually stitch it right to the book, right into it. Why go to this trouble? Undoubtedly, sewing it into the book was done as a precaution to ensure it wouldn't be lost. It was really precious to the family who owned it, otherwise they wouldn't have gone to that trouble. Though the writing on the first outer page is now faded, and the words are very difficult to read, we think they say, we can definitely read the words, the ages, but we think it says the ages of the children of William McNutt. When I first saw this, I was very excited and immediately thought of Jill Lepore's Book of Ages, The Life and Opinions of Jane Franklin. Lepore had found a booklet made by Jane, the younger sister of Benjamin Franklin, that is strikingly similar to the one under discussion. That one is at the Massachusetts Historical Society. From the correspondence between Jane and her famous brother and this poignant family record, Lepore teased out a biography of her life. We can start to do the same for the McNutt family. Olive and William McNutt's parents, their names are listed in this little booklet, and also the names of her 10 children, two sets of which were twins. Their birth dates are recorded and 3 death dates. Since 1842 is the last year cited in the booklet, we know that it stayed in the family with the psalm book until at least that year and perhaps longer. Research on ancestry revealed that the McNutt family hailed from a very small village in Darlington, Maryland. This provides as evidence for a portion of the provenance of this psalm book. So this copy began its life in 1709 in Boston, and by the last decade of the 18th century, it found its way to Maryland. It was sold in auction in Connecticut in 2013, and now the psalm book has found its way back to Massachusetts. So now I'm finally going to walk you through some of the conservation treatment that we did with the book. As already mentioned, the book's condition was carefully documented and it was photographed. Next slide, please. The book was carefully taken apart. The original sewing was removed, taking care not to tear or widen the original sewing holes so they could be reused when the text block would later be sewn back together. Remove fragments of sewing thread, the damaged headband, and even dust that was found accumulated in the gutters between the pages were saved in Mylar folders. That's what you're seeing now on the screen. The paper pages were then cleaned. This was the most time-consuming part of the process. First, the separated pages received a light cleaning done by gently rubbing eraser crumbs over the paper to remove the surface dirt. This was immediately followed by washing the pages in a deionized water bath. While the water turned yellow, the paper started to look a little brighter. In a second bath solution, calcium hydroxide was added to lower the pH of the paper and to loosen more dirt. The pages were then given a third bath, this time with magnesium bicarbonate added to the water to alkalize the paper. Then the sheets were dried on felts. Because the paper had softened as a result of the cleaning, the pages were sized with gelatin, which was applied with a brush to restore some of the crispness and crackle to the pages. Some minimal paper tears were mended with Japanese tissue. Before any further work was done, the unbound pages were digitized by a photographer. The folios were then refolded and reassembled into signatures, which were sewn back together with linen thread using the original sewing holes. Head and tail bands were recreated closely to match the originals. And yeah. Salvage period marbled paper from AAS stores were found to repair the fly sheets. Finally, a piece of calf leather was thinly pared and used as a backing for the damaged spine piece. This also provided structure needed to reattach the original front and back covers. Finally, a decision was made to keep the Book of Ages separate, what we're calling the Book of Ages, or I'm calling that, only because it was a later addition to the original 1709 book, but also because its size didn't match the pages of the Psalm book. This special book deserved its own tailor-made box to provide it extra protection. A custom box also signals that the book, when taken out, needs to be handled with extra care. So when the conservation treatment was done, we made a clamshell box covered in binder's cloth to accommodate both the book and the pamphlet. Okay, now I'm going to show you a little bit of the treatment that the book received. And if you just follow me. So we have in this water bath an example of a little primer from Vermont that Babette has started, the conservator here has started to wash the pages. This is the first bath it's receiving, and the water, you can see, is turning yellow. We made a beaker of it, but I think you don't even need to look at that because you can see what's happening in the bath. There are about 16 sheets in here, and once this is done, but tonight we'll take them out. Okay, now we're going to come over here. I've gotten, just put out here a piece of leather that's been dyed brown, just like the base songbook is. And this is what a piece of leather looks like. You can see these little marks that have been used to stretch it on a frame to make it flat. And the spine of the animal is here. Of course, the legs are here. The best part of the leather is always in the center, and the pieces around the leg are a little bit less fine. Now, what do I have here? You'll recognize this brass tool that I showed in the slide. We have it on this burner, so it's very hot. I'm going to try not to burn myself. And I'm going to show you quickly how the Cambridge panel would have been done. So I have a piece of leather set out here. The gold that I have here is not real gold. I can show you that in a minute. I have an example of that, but this is instead gold foil that's used on a modern machine to print book titles and things like that. To do it in real gold would have taken a longer amount of time than we had, because you have to brush on what's called a glare and let it dry and go through a series of steps. So we're going to hope that this works instead. So I'm going to, with considerable force, press down on the leather, tape, move it. And again, I've cheated. I've used a little blue tape to hold down the foil so it doesn't blow away. One more. I only have one chance to get this right. So if you pick the tool up and put it back down, it's not going to align. And put that back. See what we've got. This isn't as clear as I had wanted it to be. We were worried about having the burner too hot, but it gives you an idea of how the Cambridge panel was made. I brought in a book from England that I have. It's from 1722, and you can see in this case the tooling was done blind, and then maybe the tool was probably dipped in or held over a candle to have it blackened. Gold wasn't used for this particular copy, and like our base songbook, the book was sewn on these raised bands. Okay, so I'm just going to show you now how gold comes. Is in these little envelopes like that. It's really thin and hard to work with. Here's a sheet. I'm going to tear off a corner of it. You can see, I'm going to just show you how easily, here's a little part that's come apart already, and just comes apart like nothing, and actually blows into the wind. Okay, so I'm just going to show you one more thing, and that is do a little leather pairing on the edges of the leather. Leather on a book cover is thicker in the middle on the covers of the book, but on the edges it has to be made a little bit thinner so that you can do what's called the turn-in, turning it around and gluing it or pasting it to the pasteboard. So to do that, you have to press quite hard on a very, very sharp knife. And take several passes at it to get it to go. Once you do this, I'm not doing the best job, but you can see that the leather starts to just take on a different color. Oops, I've torn it. But it becomes easier to fold like this. And also when it's very thin, it will stick better to the pasteboard and not come up. So that concludes my part of the talk, and I think we're ready to take some questions. Thanks.
Go on into.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating from all of our speakers today. We've learned so much already, but we have a number of questions that we'll get to. And Babette Gehnrich has now turned on her camera so we can hear from Babette, also our chief conservator, for the Q&A portion. And so I'm going to go right to questions, and We'll get through as many as we can, and I want to start with one that came in early on in response to Elizabeth's presentation, which is what then was the first book published in the Americas, if not the Basil book. So would you like to take that, Elizabeth?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, it was 100 years earlier, in 1539. Doctrina Breva, I believe, is the title of it. It's a Spanish. What would it be? A devotional book. And so that's the first book printed in America.
Great, thank you. That was, I knew that
Short and
question
sweet.
was coming. So thank you for asking that question. Next, we have a question for JP. What do you think Fleet was trying to accomplish with that audacious placement of his name? Claiming authorship of the Psalms, of course, seems too far out, but if not this, what?
I love this question, and I'm going to answer it by saying this is the absolute pleasure of bibliographical research in the middle, because the answer is I have no idea. And your guess is as good as mine. And the guess I like the best is that he was branding himself as an old-fashioned royalist printer, of which I have no evidence whatsoever, other than that would be a cool story. So I assume it has something to do with branding, like identifying the bookseller's brand, but beyond that, it's like entirely wild speculation. And so I might put it back on you, questioners, like, what do you think it is? And I might invite everyone to think that, because until we know, who knows? If anyone wants to share a guess, I'd love to hear it.
No one is speaking up here, so
Okay.
but yeah, it's wonderful to speculate and to think about. Thank you for bringing that example to our attention. It's really fascinating. And thank you to Michael Zinman, of course. And so we have a question now from Sharon Moody, wondering if there's any information about present day congregations, reformed ones that might be using the Bay Psalm book in their worship, singing the Psalms. She sees that there are reprints of the same of the versions online, for instance, on Amazon. Any thoughts on that from anyone? And please, for all of our presenters, feel free to jump in at any point and answer questions. It doesn't have to go to any particular person. I don't know, Elizabeth, did you have thoughts on that one?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I mean, they're not the most felicitous rhymes in the Bay Psalm book. As the translators at the time said, they were, essentially focusing on they needed to get the rhymes to work correctly and be as accurate as they could. And it's a little bit of some of them are a little bit of a tongue twister. If I could pull up if you want to look one up, look up Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. That Psalm in the Bay Psalm book translation is really tricky to say. So I imagine it was tricky to sing as well. But it's a great question. I don't know if it's still being used. JP, do you know?
So I have some thoughts on this. I would love to know if it was being used. That would surprise me. From the way I'm kind of dividing up the world, there are really three different versions that exist in the time it was a functional book being used. There's the 1640, which I have a facsimile of, and not a real one. There's the Dunstern Lion one, which is the bulk of the time, and then there's the Prince edition. And so a related question is, most reprints of the Bay Psalm book or a Bay Psalm book are a reprint of a 1640. It's actually very rare to get a reprint of the post 1648 Dunstern Lion revision, which I find fascinating because it was in use for a century, and the 1640 was in use for about 7 years. So the question that was asked, I would love to know, or link to that on Amazon perhaps, because it wouldn't surprise me if it was kind of a digital copy of the 1640 kind of print on demand, but it'd be really interesting to see if people were using the kind of middle text. And I think actually the middle text is much better than the 1640. Hugh Amory suggests this too in one of his catalogs, but they're kind of fun to read and somewhat different. So
And Constantine, who's asking us to tell if we can tell a bit more about the binding and provenance markings on our copy of the 1640 Bay Psalm book. So Elizabeth, I think that one is going to go to you.
Yeah, and could we get the doc cam on this one too? I'm gonna try and there we go. This, you probably won't be able to read this because I can't, we're not opening it up too much, but I just wanted to, before answering that question, just read that little bit of Psalm 23. Oh, okay. Well, it's gonna be hard for me to read now. I'm gonna read it to you and then we'll show you. So to show you that kind of infelicitous language. The Lord to me a shepherd is, want therefore shall not I. He in the folds of tender grass does cause me down to lie. To waters calm me gently leads, restores my soul doth he. He doth in paths of righteousness for his name's sake lead me. So those of you who know it in just prose form, rather than trying to put it into this rhythmic verse that could be sung more easily to the tunes that early Americans were used to singing, and not just early Americans, sorry, everybody in Europe as well, were singing to, this would have been a challenge. So I'll turn it around now so you can get a better view. And Psalm 23, I think it's on this side. Actually, it probably starts here. So the question was actually about the binding and provenance of this one. So it was, again, with this upside down, it's gonna be a little bit hard for me to read, but there is a note at the front from Isaiah Thomas. So I'm gonna show it to you quickly, and then I'm gonna turn it around and read it. So this is the note, and it says, after advertising for another copy of this book and making inquiries in many places in New England, etc., I was not able to obtain or even hear of another copy. This copy is therefore invaluable and must be preserved with the greatest care. It is in its original binding, IT for Isaiah Thomas, September 25th, it looks like, 1820. And it says below that, New England version of the Psalms. So that's our information from Isaiah Thomas about its provenance. We also, later in it, it has signatures of Samuel Sewell, who would have been, he was the previous owner, and there are some other annotations in it as well. I usually don't get to spend a lot of time with this. We try not to pull it out ourselves, just only take it out when it's needed by scholars. So you all are the scholars today that are giving me the excuse to take this out and take a look at it. So any other questions, let us know.
Great.
Elizabeth, can I piggyback? I want to read Psalm 23 in the Dunster Lion beginning. So would that be okay? Do people want that? The Lord to me a shepherd is, want therefore shall not I. Those two lines are exactly the same. This is where it changes. He in the lords of tender grass doth make me down to lie. He leads me to the waters still, restore my soul doth he. In paths of righteousness he will, for his name's sake lead me. And so I find this characteristic actually of the difference of the two, right? This is a little bit smoother. It's more sing-songy. If you read Dr. Seuss, you can kind of hear the meter in it a little bit better. The 1640, some of the sentences are inside out. He in the folds of tender grass doth cause me down to lie, becomes he in the folds of tender grass doth make me down to lie, right? And you can hear the difference in the text versions, and they actually continue to change slowly. So I thought that would be fun to compare. I'm glad you pulled that one out, Elizabeth.
That's very good. Thank you. Very cool. All right. Well, we have several other questions. I wanted actually to pitch something to Babette, if you don't mind, Babette, since we haven't heard from you yet. I know, as Elizabeth mentioned, this is a book that does not come out too often. Could you say a little bit about the measures that are put into place when a book of this age and rarity does come out for readers? Would you like to offer some comments on that?
Yeah, certainly. So, first of all, a scholar would have to have a good reason to want to see the original. We try to create surrogates of the content of important materials that are unique, maybe single known copies. But obviously there are times where a scholar will need, like JP, will need to see the original. So we try to, because we do not want to alter the original condition. We don't want to rebind. We want to prevent losing original material. So any book, anything that is in a binding still, we will view in a cradle. And so in the case of the Bay Psalm book, because it's still in its original binding and miraculously in perfect condition, we will place them in a cradle. And this one is very, very narrowly angled because we have to be mindful that these things are now 300-400 years old, and that will prevent binding damage. And doing conservation to bindings is frequently invasive, and we may in the process lose original material. So it's all about prevention. It's limiting access. So I always say, with our curators, it's not personal. I wear the conservation hat, and I'm there to police access. And then the curators and reference services, of course, need to work with our scholars and need to support their research. So it's a dialogue, and we have learned not to take it personally at AAS and just have a conversation about when things can be accessed and when not. And it's a great thing when you're in a place where people are very collaborative, because there were times where
When Nancy did on this, the book that Nancy was, the 1709 version, makes it more accessible for people as well, allows them to.
exactly.
All right, so we have a good question here from Daniel Tonner, who's asking if you could say a little bit more about the Algonquin versions. Elizabeth, do you want to?
I'm going to pass that to JP, because I know
JP?
he was mentioning.
I hope we can do them both together because I've noted their existence. Part of what's difficult about a project I'm doing is it can keep getting really, really big. It's one of the reasons I say functional and everyday, because after 1800 you get all these reprints, which we've started talking about, but it gets really, really messy. So evidence points to John Eliot using the Bay Psalm version when he makes a translation. There is a possibly existent edition of which no one's seen a copy of, and then there's a later one. The one which is reported to exist is an interlinear, so Massachusetts and English version of the Psalms, demonstrating the possibility of translation and Eliot's competency in it. It's reported in letters. We've never seen a copy of it. It's not known to exist anymore. There's a copy of the Genesis where he did this at University College London, and that one does exist. So you can kind of guess what it looks like. I think it probably existed, but who knows? And the later version, they end up attaching it to the completed Bibles almost as an afterthought. You would typically put a metrical psalter at the end of your Bible. So you'd have the Psalms in prose, and at the end you'd have a singing Psalms or metrical Psalms. And kind of we've completed the Massachusetts translation, we're sending it back to London to demonstrate to the people who paid for the Corporation for the Propagation of the Gospel to do this, that it was done. They say, oh, we should really quickly print off those Psalms we printed and stick them on the back. And so those end up those. And lots of those. Comparatively more of those exist. Does that, Elizabeth, you can riff more on that maybe.
Yeah. No, I think that was it. That was
Okay.
great. I'll just show, since we have the doc cam, we can just show an example of this is a different Psalms, but you can see it's not interlinear, but you can see one column is in the Algonquin language, and then one column is in English as you go across there.
Great, thank you.
I'll just leave that up.
Yep. And another question here is from Miriam Khan, who wonders if any of the Bay Psalm editions have Hebrew response that along with the English. No, JP's shaking his head.
No, but they're Hebrew type.
Elizabeth,
You go ahead and talk. I'll find it.
I think it's only Massachusetts, and I hadn't thought of it. Miriam, this is a very smart observation. I think that if you have if you accept that this is one tradition of a text with three versions, the only parallel languages is stuff like what Elizabeth has. I could be wrong.
So I can go on the doc cam again with the 1640. There isn't a parallel Hebrew text, but there are. You'll see.
Yeah.
We can zoom in at all. I'm going to move this a little bit and let us zoom in. There is actually Hebrew type, and this is the first appearance of Hebrew in printing in North America. I think that's correct. We can check me again. But if you can zoom in even more, you can see they're talking here about how they're doing their translation work. And so they're showing you in Hebrew and then their translations.
Great, that's fascinating. Wonderful, thank you for finding that. Okay, so Chris Phillips is wondering, JP, what kind of edition would you most wish was available for today's readers, whether scholarly or otherwise? Of course, that would come from Chris Phillips.
I mean, I want to hear that. I think that was someone said ooh, and I think it might have been Elizabeth. So I want to hear your answer too. Because I have two answers. I have a selfish answer, and the selfish answer is I don't want that edition to exist because I want to be at a massive Verorum project. As far as I can tell, just looking at the bibliography, the editions, the 60 some odd editions, differ considerably, even between different versions. And no one's really been motivated to find those differences. And sometimes a typo is corrected into a new word and it slowly morphs. And I think there's actually a very, very rich history of American usage embedded in a, massive Virorum project that looks at all the variations of every line and every edition. That's the one I want. That's maybe not great for teaching, and also maybe not something that you can finish necessarily in a lifetime. So that's kind of a dodge too. The cheap move is the actually the ProQuest digitizations that originally came from the American Antiquarian Society and other places. The Evans, you can get particular copies, but you just don't know the text. I want to know what Elizabeth had to say, though.
No, I just was excited to hear what you had to say. So.
Okay, well, great. We have a question here that I think it should go to the conservators in the room about the first edition. Wouldn't it be better also to wash the pages, just like the 1709 one, and to fully photograph it? He knows that there are only a few pictures of this copy on the website.
Babette, we can't hear you.
You need to unmute. Yep.
There we go. All right.
Perfect.
So because the binding is perfect and rather tight, it is difficult to access the content. So it would be easier to, and that's maybe a question for Elizabeth, I don't know if a surrogate exists from another copy that was perhaps not in as good condition. So, we're reticent to cause damage to an early binding in perfect condition just to provide a digital surrogate. So yeah, oftentimes you're lucky and maybe a copy exists at a different institution where the binding is compromised and the content very much accessible. And then we will just create a link to our MARC record to the digital surrogates from a different institution. So we do that frequently.
Thank you. We have a question here from Mitch Goodrum, who says, wonderful presentation. That question just disappeared. Did we answer Mitch's question? Oh, I thought okay, that was Chris's. Did we answer Mitch's? Okay, we will move on then to, yeah, we did answer Williams just now, but I don't think we did Mitch's.
So Gehnrich answered.
That is fine. We'll move on to Stevens. No, we'll move on to Ezra's. They keep disappearing from my screen. Lovely to know that Ezra Greenspan is here. Quick note, it looks to my eye that the Hebrew word for Tehillim, for Psalms, that Elizabeth showed is misspelled. Oh, interesting.
Fascinating.
Wow. With 2 L's instead of 1. Thank you, Ezra. That is fascinating. Okay, so here is Mitch's question. Great sleuthing on Eliezer Phillips' role as bookseller and bookbinder for JP. Is there potential to scour the AAS stacks for other books bound by him or using similar tools? A fellowship opportunity, perhaps.
I can answer that question. So I just actually discovered that a few days ago. So we really haven't had time to do further research, but we will try to find other books that were either have his name as a bookseller. I don't know if we're going to find anything about that has his name as a bookbinder. So that's just research that needs to be ongoing, just like the watermark search that would like to keep going on. But yeah, it's a
Great.
fascinating project.
Yeah, no, good. Thank you for bringing that whole question and that role of Phillips to our attention. That was very interesting. Okay, well, we are past 5 o'clock, and I promised I would wrap up as close to 5 o'clock as possible. So I do want to thank all of our presenters today. I want to thank all of you for joining us in the audience. Great questions, and we hope that you have enjoyed the program. We hope that you will also come back and see what other programs we have to offer this year. I want to just bring your attention to a couple of upcoming programs. One yet this month on January 23rd, 7 p.m. virtual program, a program with Iran Zelnick, who's a former fellow who has a new book, first book out, American Laughter, American Fury. So we hope you can join us for that. And then in February, a program called The Many Legacies of Mary Ann Shadd Cary with Nika Denny and Kristen Morat, who will both have published on Shadd Cary. And that program will be in conversation with Derek Spires. So hope you can join us on February 19th at 7 p.m. also for a virtual program. Thank you so much for joining us, and good evening.